My name is Emma Walker, a fashion designer based in London. At 29, I had finally begun making my mark designing pieces that turned heads on runways and filled my calendar with orders. But everything changed the moment my phone rang at 3:00 a.m. My sister Elise was sobbing on the other end, telling me our father had suffered a massive heart attack. In that instant, nothing else mattered. I booked the earliest flight home, leaving behind my studio, my apartment, and the future I'd fought for. I thought I was coming back because of love, because family needed me. But as I stood in an empty hospital room hours later, I realized it wasn't love that brought me home. It was the $8.2 million they planned to steal. I remember the exact smell of the airport at dawn, burnt coffee industrial cleaner, and the stale breath of 1,000 strangers. My fingers were numb as I clutched my boarding pass, Heathrow to JFK to Hartford. A journey carved out of grief, urgency, and something darker I refused to name. On the flight, the cabin lights flickered between darkness and dawn. I watched reflections ripple along the oval window, trying to imagine my father dying alone. Guilt curled around my ribs like barbed wire. I had always been his favorite, his beautiful daughter who refused to join the family business, who left for London with only sketches and a scholarship. He'd called me his little comet. Bright, unstoppable, always burning towards something distant, and now was his comet coming home just to watch him burn out. When I landed, my brother Eric was waiting. His hug was stiff. The scent of his expensive cologne mingled with the lie in his eyes. He looked at me the way a man might look at a lever he needed to pull. As we drove through town, the morning sun revealed new buildings wearing our family name in cold glass letters. Walker Developments, shiny, hollow. Built over the bones of orchards and old neighbors' houses. Dad's empire, Eric's pride. Dad's been asking for you, Eric said softly, like he cared, but his eyes never met mine in the mirror. At the hospital, the nurse shook her head. No record, no patient by that name. My mouth tasted of old pennies. Acid pooled in my stomach. I turned to Eric, but his gaze flickered away. That's when the truth slid cold down my spine. My father wasn't here. Maybe he was never sick at all. What is this? I asked, my voice splintering in the sterile hallway. Where is he? Eric's shoulders slumped under his designer suit. Let's just go home, he whispered. Home. The word felt rancid. When we arrived, the house was filled with people I hadn't seen in years. Faces turned to me, not with relief, not with grief, but with calculation. Bernard, the family lawyer, sat with his leather briefcase, open papers fanned out like weapons. Elise was there too, the sister whose sobs had pulled me across an ocean, now sipping coffee with her legs tucked elegantly under her. My mother adjusted her pearl earrings, gaze cool mouth pressed into a thin line that had always meant disappointment. Then he appeared. My father, not dying, not frail, just him. Holding a tumbler of bourbon at 9 a.m, wearing that same navy cashmere sweater he'd worn every Christmas. His hair perfectly combed back silver at the temple skin flushed with health. Emma, he breathed, spreading his arms as if the last 24 hours hadn't been a lie that fractured everything between us. Sweetheart, you're home. Home. No, this wasn't home. This was the cage I'd escaped 5 years ago. I stepped back from his embrace. My pulse thundered against my ribs. Rage seared my throat. You lied to me, I whispered, but the words burned with acid. You made me think you were dying. Silence pulsed through the room. Only the ticking of the grandfather clock filled the space between us. Dad sighed and glanced at Bernard, who shuffled his papers. Emma, Dad said, voice dipped in gentle authority. There's been a situation with the company. We needed you here. Your inheritance matures in 3 weeks and there it was. The truth in its ugliest form. This isn't about family I spat, my voice shaking. "This is about money." He opened his mouth to speak, but I saw it then, the fear behind his practiced calm, the desperation coiling through his words. My beautiful father, my comet maker, was nothing more than a drowning man clawing for the nearest floating body to keep himself above water. I felt a blade of clarity pierce through the hurt. They'd used my grief like a key. They thought I was still the naive girl who left with dreams in her suitcase and tears on her cheeks. But London had taught me something. The world wasn't kind to girls who burned bright. It wanted them quiet, controlled, diminished into embers. I had learned to keep my flame hidden until I needed it most. I looked around at their faces, each one flickering with guilt, fear, greed. My mother's trembling hands, Eric's rigid posture, Elise's downturned eyes. They wanted my money to keep their illusion alive, the Walker empire pristine on the outside, rotting within. They didn't know the woman standing before them. The woman who had stitched rejection and pain into armor, who had bled for every runway slot, who had learned that love and loyalty were two separate currencies. My father stepped forward, his voice breaking with forced affection. "Emma, we're family. We have to stand together." "No," I whispered, feeling something ancient and powerful awaken inside me. "You taught me that blood means nothing when there's money involved. Now it's time you learned what I've become." They thought this was a family meeting. They didn't know it was the opening move in a war. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake in my childhood bed, staring at the ceiling where faded, glow-in-the-dark stars still clung to the cracked plaster. Each one a fossil of memory, of tiny palms pressing sticky plastic, to paint of giggles echoing in a room that once smelled of apple shampoo and safety. Each star reminded me of the father who used to lift me onto his shoulders so I could reach the highest corners. Now they were nothing but tiny glowing tombstones for a love he'd weaponized to save himself. At dawn I rose. The house was silent except for the hum of the fridge downstairs and the old pipes sighing behind the walls. I moved like a ghost, barefoot on cold hardwood floors that creaked beneath my weight but told no secrets. I gathered what I needed: my laptop, my grandfather's trust documents, and the small notebook I'd carried since London, its pages filled with sketches of dresses and lately contingency plans sharp enough to cut. I drove to Pete's Diner, the only place awake before 6, and ordered black coffee so bitter it burned straight through my chest, cauterizing the last remnants of grief. Margaret was already there, sitting by the window, where weak dawn light turned her silver hair to steel. Her eyes, sharp behind thin-frame glasses, flicked up at me with something like approval. "Sit," she commanded, wasting no breath on pleasantries. "What's your plan? I need information." I said, my voice flat and cold with resolve. "Real numbers, real debts, real crimes." Without hesitation, Margaret reached into her handbag and slid an envelope across the table. Inside were photocopies of property deeds, hidden bank records, lawsuits buried in back pages of newspapers no one read, the rot laid bare. "They've been operating like a Ponzi scheme for nearly 2 years," she said, her voice low and even. "Your inheritance isn't to save the business, it's to keep them out of prison." I exhaled shakily. Fear should have curled inside my gut like a viper. Instead, something colder and infinitely more precise slid into place within me. They thought they could lure me back with grief and guilt. They thought they could corner me into obedience again. But they forgot the most important rule of hunting: never corner something willing to bite back. By 8 a.m., I was sitting across from Dylan in a booth at a coffee shop one town over. My high school boyfriend, now a financial crimes investigator. He still had the same steady hazel eyes that once made 17-year-old me feel like the world wasn't quite so dangerous. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice gentle but braced for impact. And I did. Every lie, every forged signature, every hidden asset siphoned from trust funds meant to be my lifeline. His jaw tightened with each revelation, the muscle ticking as if it hurt to hear. "Emma," he said quietly, using the name only he still called me. If even half of what you're saying is true, they're not just bankrupt, they're criminals. Good, I replied, surprised by the quiet violence in my own voice. I need to know exactly how to take them down. For 2 hours, we outlined every possible angle: financial fraud, investor deception, wire fraud, money laundering. For each, Dylan explained the federal statutes, the penalties, the procedures. I took notes methodically, like sketching a gown pattern. It was no different. Fabric could hide flaws, so could numbers. But under enough light, every imperfection showed. By noon, I was sitting across from Margaret's nephew, a private investigator who specialized in corporate corruption. By 3, I had a dossier outlining offshore account shell companies, hidden properties, false valuations. Proof that the Walker Empire was built on sand and painted to look like marble. That night, I sat at my old desk, the one with unicorn stickers peeling from the drawers, and wrote out my plan, each step in sharp, deliberate strokes. Gather evidence, secure the trust, expose the fraud, protect the innocent, leave no mercy for the guilty. I thought about the girl I was when I left for London. Naïve, eager, desperate to prove her worth to people who would never see her as anything but convenient. That girl was dead. In her place stood a woman who knew that love was a currency in the wrong hands and loyalty was just leverage for those who worshipped power. At midnight, I closed my notebook. Outside, moonlight spilled silver over frostbitten grass. Inside the house, slept dreaming peacefully in ignorance. They still thought the daughter who came home was their salvation. They didn't know that the girl they'd broken had returned as their reckoning. I whispered into the silence, each word a blade slicing through the shadows. You want me back. You want my money. Then watch as I burn down everything you built, and know this time I'm playing to win. By dawn, I was already moving. I dressed in black slacks and a steel gray blouse hair, pulled into a severe bun, minimal makeup. The girl who once wove eyeliner wings before every meeting in London had been replaced by someone harder. Someone who understood the importance of shadows over shine. I started with the basement filing cabinets. Dad had always believed in paper trails contracts, investor letters, fake quarterly reports printed on an embossed Walker development stationery. Each page smelled faintly of toner and bourbon, a scent that clung to my father like sin. I photographed everything, my phone clicking steadily like a heartbeat. 425 images by noon. Evidence of fraud, layered over fraud loans taken under false pretenses, contractor payments siphoned to shell companies, property appraisals deliberately inflated to secure lines of credit. The Walker Empire wasn't a business. It was a carcass crawling with maggots disguised as profits. After lunch, I met Dylan again, this time in the parking lot of an abandoned strip mall, once touted as the future of Hartford retail. The future was boarded up, the parking lines fading under weeds. This was a Walker project too, wasn't it? I asked, staring at the peeling "Coming Soon" banners. He nodded grimly. Millions raised, nothing delivered. Investors lost everything. I turned to him. I need your help getting this to the right people. SEC, FBI, state, financial crimes. Everyone. Dylan's gaze locked with mine. For a moment, the boy he used to be flickered through, the boy who had kissed me under bleachers, who had promised to protect me forever. Now he was a man keeping that promise in a way neither of us could have imagined back then. I'll make the calls tonight, he said. Emma, when this goes down, there's no turning back. I looked at the dead strip mall before us, the grass splitting concrete, like silent screams. Good, I said. I don't ever want to go back. That evening, I slipped into my old bedroom to find Elise waiting on my bed. She wore a silk robe, hair brushed into loose waves, the picture of a dutiful daughter, fresh from her skincare routine. You're late, she said softly. For what? For dinner. Dad's expecting you. I sat down at my desk without answering, flipping open my notebook. Elise watched me in silence before her composure cracked. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "Emma, don't do this." I turned to her, studying her face, the sister who had once braided my hair before dances, who had called me crying from college when her first boyfriend cheated, who now watched me with pleading eyes because she knew what I was capable of. "You helped them lie to me," I said calmly. "You let me think Dad was dying. You let me grieve him." Tears pooled in her lashes. "I didn't know what else to do. They're desperate. Everything is falling apart." "Then let it fall," I whispered. "Sometimes destruction is the only honest thing left." She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. The warmth of her fingers felt like betrayal. "Emma, we're still sisters." I met her gaze steadily. "Blood is nothing when it's poisoned." After dinner, I excused myself with polite lies and drove to Margaret's house. The old woman opened her door before I knocked, as if she'd been standing there waiting in the dim yellow hallway. "I've been expecting you," she said. Inside, we spread out the files and photos across her dining table. The smell of lavender and old books surrounded us, comforting and melancholy. "James Sullivan will support you," Margaret said, pouring tea with trembling hands. "He drafted the trust for your grandfather. He's seen this coming for years." I nodded, memorizing every name, every hidden account, every offshore transfer. Each one was a matchstick. Together they would burn the Walker name down to its bones. "You're doing the right thing," Emma Margaret said, her eyes shining wet under the lamplight. "But it will hurt. Truth always does." I swallowed the rising ache in my chest. Hurt had never stopped me before. Neither had fear. Neither would love not anymore. Late that night, I sat alone in my car outside the family estate, watching its darkened windows. Each one was a watching eye. Each brick whispered secrets. For the first time, I felt nothing for this place. No nostalgia, no pain, only a cold, clean clarity. Tomorrow, I would meet James Sullivan. Tomorrow, I would finalize complaints to federal agencies. Tomorrow, I would gather my silent allies, Dylan, Margaret, James, and every victim my family had betrayed. And when everything was ready, I would walk back into that house, sit across from my father, look him in the eyes, and let him know. The daughter he thought he owned was about to destroy the kingdom he built from lies. That night, sleep never came. I lay on the stiff mattress of my childhood bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling where shadows pulsed with every passing car outside. The house breathed around me, floorboards shifting with the sigh of old wood pipes groaning in the walls like restless ghosts. Every creak was a memory. Every silent corridor, a graveyard of dreams I once carried like bright paper lanterns, only to watch them burn. At 2:00 a.m., I stopped pretending. I swung my legs out from under the thin blanket, the icy floor biting at my bare feet, rooting me in the moment. For a long time, I sat there in the dark, spine-curved arms resting heavy on my knees, listening to my own breathing as I tried to quiet the chaos roaring inside my chest. They thought they knew me. They thought they knew the girl who stood in this room years ago, clutching her sketchbook to her chest, like armor scribbling designs in the margins of calculus homework, dreaming of lace and silk while her family scoffed at wasting her potential. But they didn't know the woman London forged from that girl, the woman who learned to turn rejection into steel betrayal, into weapons heartbreak, into a blade honed sharp by trembling bloodied hands. I rose and crossed the room, moving with silent purpose. From under the bed, I pulled out my battered suitcase. Unzipping the lining, I retrieved my backup phone, a cheap, unregistered Nokia bought in cash from a London street vendor. The burner phone felt cold and unfamiliar in my palm, humming with the promise of secrets. I switched it on the screen, flickering pale blue in the darkness, and began typing rapidly. To Dylan, subject evidence chain tomorrow, I meet James Sullivan. Full trust documents and offshore proofs by afternoon. Begin prepping SEC and FBI contacts. Full backups uploading to secured cloud folder codename Comet. To Margaret, subject contingency. If anything happens to me, initiate protocol. Codes remain unchanged. I pressed send and sat back staring at the screen until its glow blurred with tears I refused to let fall. This was beyond family now, beyond betrayal and personal revenge. This was for every pensioner whose retirement savings built these empty glass towers. For every contractor left unpaid, every employee discarded like bruised fruit to protect an empire rotting from within. This was justice, not vengeance. Or maybe it was both. At dawn, I dressed with surgical precision black jeans, fitted charcoal turtleneck hair slicked back into a knot tight enough to sting. No jewelry except the thin silver bangle my grandfather gave me on my 16th birthday, the only Walker gift that never carried hidden terms. I looked at myself in the mirror, absorbing the reflection with a dispassionate gaze. Not the fashion designer, not the golden daughter, not the naive girl who once believed blood was thicker than truth. Only Emma, clear-eyed, merciless, ready. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled of burnt toast and desperation. Mom stood at the counter, bathed in the flickering light of her phone screen, shoulders curled inward like a wilting flower. She glanced up, startled by my silent arrival. "Emma, you're up early." "Couldn't sleep," I said evenly. My voice stripped of anything that could be mistaken for affection. She hesitated, eyes narrowing as she studied my face. "You look different." I poured black coffee into my travel mug, feeling the warmth seep into my numb fingers. "I am." I turned and walked out before she could answer my boots, thudding across the polished marble floor, the same marble she chose to impress dinner guests, cold and gleaming, like a silent accusation beneath my steps. For a brief second, I caught my reflection. The daughter she saw was gone. In her place stood something she could never control. Outside, the sky was steel gray, streaked with pale lavender at the horizon's edge. The dawn wind slapped my cheeks, crisp and stinging, waking every nerve ending in my skin. I walked to my car, each step sinking me deeper into the person I needed to be today. I was done grieving, done loving people who saw me only as currency, done hoping for redemption in places that worship power above truth. Today was for strategy, tomorrow was for war. And when the sun rose on that war, they would finally understand. They never called back a daughter. They summoned their reckoning. By 8:00 a.m., I was sitting in the mahogany-paneled office of James Sullivan. The old lawyer studied me over his reading glasses, his hands folded neatly atop my grandfather's trust documents. Sunlight spilled through tall windows, pooling across the polished desk and illuminating the faded blue veins beneath his thin skin like river maps etched by time. "Emma," he said quietly. His voice graveled with age and caution. "You understand what you're about to do." I met his gaze without flinching. "Yes." He sighed, the sound rustling like dry leaves, and leaned back in his worn leather chair. "Your grandfather anticipated this. Malcolm always said your father's ambition would eclipse his integrity. That's why he made the trust irrevocable without your signature. Charles tried to contest it after Malcolm's death, but he failed." I nodded, absorbing every word with a cold precision sharpened by betrayal. "They think I'm weak enough to sign everything over. That's their first mistake." James's eyes gleamed with something that might have been pride. "And their second, that they believe I came here alone." By noon, I was sitting in Dylan's car in the dim concrete of a downtown parking garage. Harsh, fluorescent lights flickered overhead, painting his face in sharp angles, shadows collecting under his cheekbones. He read through the files I handed him, each page thick with evidence of wire fraud, securities, fraud, investor deception, and financial misrepresentation. The air between us hummed with unspoken horror. Finally, he closed the folder, exhaling a slow, careful breath. "This isn't just a family scandal, Emma. This is federal prison time." If you hadn't come back, they would have buried this under your inheritance, bought themselves a few more years, then collapsed anyway, dragging you and every investor down with them. Can you get this to the SEC and FBI today? I asked, my voice stripped of hesitation. Yes, he replied instantly. I have contacts in both agencies. They'll prioritize it. But Emma? His voice softened, and for a fleeting moment I saw the boy who once sketched dream houses for me in math class, a boy who believed in happy endings. You're putting yourself in danger. People facing prison, they make desperate choices. I felt a chill coil low in my chest, but forced myself to meet his eyes. I know. That's why I'm moving before they realize I'm not playing their game. By 3:00 p.m., I was back at Margaret's dining table, porcelain teacups pushed aside to make room for war. Her nephew, Alan, a private investigator with printer ink staining his cuticles, spread out color-coded charts showing offshore accounts in the Cayman's properties buried under shell corporations, sudden unexplained transfers funneled through consulting fees. The smell of burned toner clung to the pages like smoke. They've been laundering investor money for years, he said flatly, each word dropping like an anvil. Your brother's been siphoning side funds into personal accounts. Your mother has been liquidating jewelry to move assets into her maiden name. Elise's involvement is minimal but complicit. And your father? Alan shook his head. He's the architect of it all. What about criminal intimidation? I asked. Any signs of enforcement tactics? Alan hesitated, flipping through notes. Possibly. Your father has connections to unregulated financiers, the kind that don't believe in court summonses when debts go unpaid. I inhaled slowly, feeling the chill in my chest spread outward, cooling my veins into steel. So the threats were real, their desperation absolute. That night, I sat cross-legged on Margaret's living room floor, files and laptops fanned out around me like a battlefield general studying maps under flickering candlelight. My phone buzzed with coded texts, each one hammering another nail into the coffin of their Empire James Trust locked. No legal loopholes found. Dillon FBI Financial Crimes Unit and SEC reviewing evidence. Warrants imminent. Allen offshore account tracing complete. Documents uploaded to secure folder Comet. Margaret T. ready. Your army awaits dear. I closed my eyes for a moment, inhaling the dusty lavender scent of her old carpet, letting the rising storm within me settle into something colder, sharper, deadlier. I thought of my father swirling bourbon in his crystal glass smug in his empire of illusions. I thought of my mother twisting her pearls around her neck like a noose she still believed was jewelry. I thought of Eric gripping his steering wheel until his knuckles whitened, with the strain of secrets he could never confess. And Elise. Her tears falling silent, not for the crimes committed, but for the ruin they would now reap. They built a kingdom out of lies and convinced themselves it was indestructible. They thought their daughter would become just another brick in their foundation, cemented in place by duty and shame. But they had forgotten something crucial. I was never part of their foundation. I was the earthquake coming to tear it apart. At dawn tomorrow, I would walk back into that house. I would sit at their gleaming oak table, betrayal behind me, justice coiling like steel in my chest. And I would look into my father's eyes as his kingdom burned around him, the ash settling in his thinning hair, the empire he built from stolen lives collapsing under its own weight. Then in the silence after the final blow fell, I would speak the words I had been forging in the furnace of my silence for years. You thought you raised a princess, but what you created was a queen with nothing left to lose. And as their world crumbled brick by bloody brick, they would finally understand. They never called back a daughter. They summoned their reckoning. Morning arrived like a blade to the throat. I dressed deliberately, black pencil skirt, cream silk blouse buttoned to the throat, hair slicked back into a tight low bun that pulled at my scalp just enough to anchor me to the moment. No jewelry except for my grandfather's silver bangle circling my wrist like a promise. As I fastened the last pearl at my collar, I studied my reflection in the mirror. Calm, composed, unbreakable. Downstairs, the house buzzed with forced cheerfulness like an orchestra tuning before the slaughter. My mother arranged pastries on crystal trays with trembling fingers, adjusting each strawberry with obsessive precision as if perfection could ward off ruin. Eric paced near the dining table, phone pressed to his ear, barking clipped commands to some trembling subordinate who had dared to exist in his orbit this morning. Elise sat silently, her eyes swollen from tears she would never let them see, picking at the edge of her napkin until it shredded between her fingers. And my father stood at the head of the table, bourbon in hand, though it wasn't yet 9 a.m., his smile wide and false as gilded rot. A king awaiting tribute from the daughter he believed was too broken to fight. There she is, he announced, his voice oozing smug satisfaction. Our beautiful Emma. Sit down, sweetheart. Bernard is ready with the papers. Bernard, the family lawyer, sat across from me, sweat beading along his balding scalp. His manicured fingers trembled as he pushed the contracts forward. Once signed, he began voice shaking. Your trust will transfer seamlessly to Walker Developments as a limited partnership interest. Explain it all, I interrupted softly, placing my phone face up on the table, the recorder blinking red. For the record. Bernard hesitated, eyes flicking to my father for approval. Do it, Dad snapped, taking a long swallow of bourbon. So, Bernard explained, every clause, every condition, every hidden landmine disguised in legal Latin to strip me of ownership while giving the company absolute control. As he spoke, I watched my family. Eric's foot tapped an anxious rhythm beneath the table. Mom sipped her coffee, leaving a rose-stained smear on the porcelain rim. Elise picked at her cuticle until a bead of blood bloomed at her fingertip. Dad sat smug, swirling his glass with lazy arrogance, already tasting his victory. When Bernard finished, the room fell silent, heavy with expectation. I let it hang. Let them sit in their arrogance. Let them taste the sweetness of a victory they believed inevitable. Then I smiled. Thank you, Bernard, I said evenly. I turned to my father, locking eyes with the man who once taught me constellations on the back porch, never knowing he was forging his greatest threat. You've all worked so hard on this. Relief softened their shoulders. Dad chuckled, lifting his glass. Well, we're a family, Emma. We stand together. I nodded slowly. Yes, we do. At that moment, the doorbell rang. The chime sliced through the room like a guillotine blade. Mom flinched, spilling coffee onto her trembling hand. Eric froze mid-text, his phone slipping from his fingers. Dad's eyes narrowed suspicion, flickering like a dying match. I'll get it, I said calmly. I rose and walked to the door heels, tapping a precise rhythm across the marble floors they once thought would impress the world. I opened it wide. Outside stood James Sullivan grave, an immovable as granite Margaret at his side, her sharp eyes glittering with quiet triumph. Behind them stood Dylan, flanked by two men in dark suits. Further back, black SUVs idled at the curb, engines humming low. Agents stepped out, badges flashing gold in the cold morning light. Emma James said, his voice carrying through the foyer, solid and unbreakable. Are they all here? I turned to look at my father as realization drained the color from his face, leaving him pale as ash. Yes, I said, they're all here. The agents entered like a quiet storm. Charles Walker, one agent, announced, his voice clipped and edged with authority. I'm Special Agent Heather Reynolds with the FBI. We have warrants to search these premises and seize all financial records related to Walker Development's activities. You are under investigation for wire fraud, securities, fraud, money laundering, and investor deception. My father shot to his feet chair, scraping across the marble with a screech. What is this? He roared his composure, fracturing into rage. "Emma, what have you done?" I met his fury with a calm so cold it burned. "I protected Grandpa's legacy. I protected every family you robbed. And I protected myself." Agents moved through the house with tactical precision. Eric lunged forward, eyes wild with panic, but Dylan stepped between us, hand resting lightly on the firearm at his hip. "Don't," Dylan said softly, his voice like iron wrapped in silk. "Don't make this worse." Mom collapsed into her chair, her perfect hair trembling as silent sobs racked her shoulders, mascara bleeding black rivers down her cheeks. Elise sat, frozen tears slipping quietly down her face, her small sobs lost in the chaos. "You think you've won?" Dad spat, his voice guttural with hate as agents cuffed his wrists behind him. "You think this makes you strong? You've destroyed your own family." I leaned closer until he could see the truth burning in my eyes. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of everything unspoken. "You destroyed us the moment you decided your empire mattered more than your children." Bernard was being cuffed, whimpering as agents read him his rights. Eric screamed curses into the polished floor as two men pinned him down. Mom sobbed quietly, rocking back and forth, pearls clinking against her teacup like funeral bells. Only Elise remained untouched, her tears falling for the kingdom they lost, not for the sins that built it. When it was done, when my family stood in a silent, cuffed line, when the agents carried boxes of incriminating documents out to the waiting SUVs, I stood in the center of their shattered kingdom, breathing in the ruin like cold mountain air. My father glared at me, hatred burning in his eyes like a final curse. "You're no longer my daughter," he hissed as they dragged him away. I watched him go, feeling nothing but the fierce wind of freedom rush through the hollow he left behind. "I stopped being your daughter," I whispered into the silent wreckage, "the day you decided I was just your last bank account." Margaret approached, her frail hand curling around my wrist, grounding me back to earth. "It's over," she said softly. I shook my head. "No, Margaret, it's only just begun." Because now I would rebuild. Not the kingdom they lost, but something honest, something real, something that could never be stolen or betrayed. And for the first time in my life, as dawn spilled gold across the broken glass of my family's lies, I felt powerful. Not because I had destroyed them, but because I had finally saved myself. For days after their arrests, the house felt like a mausoleum. I walked its silent halls, past marble floors that no longer gleamed chandeliers, gathering dust, the smell of stale bourbon lingering in Dad's study, like the memory of his power. Each room whispered fragments of the life we had once pretended to live here. Sunday brunches with forced laughter, dinner parties, heavy with silent deals, birthdays measured in price tags instead of love. I thought I would feel triumphant. I thought revenge would taste like victory. But it tasted like ashes. One morning, as dawn broke pink over the front lawn, I walked outside barefoot, the grass wet and cold beneath my feet. Margaret was waiting by the mailbox, her silhouette small but unbreakable against the rising sun. "It's time," she said softly. Within a week, with James Sullivan's guidance, I established the Walker Restitution Fund. My inheritance matured on my 30th birthday as scheduled. I used a large portion to repay every investor my family defrauded: elderly couples, single mothers, retired teachers, construction workers unpaid for months of labor, people whose dreams they had shattered to keep their illusions alive. Each repayment felt like pulling a nail from my own ribs, painful, necessary, healing. The rest of the trust I invested into creating something honest, something untainted by Walker greed. I purchased the gutted office tower that once bore our family name and transformed it into Community Development Partners, a nonprofit dedicated to completing abandoned projects ethically. We finished half-built apartment complexes and offered units at fair rents. We reopened shopping centers with local businesses, not chains. We hired contractors laid off by Walker Developments and paid them fair wages on time every time. On the building's facade, the gilded Walker letters were removed. In their place, a simple bronze plaque read, "Built on truth, not legacy." Margaret joined the board of directors. Dylan consulted on financial compliance, his quiet confidence anchoring every decision. Over months, the professional blurred into personal. He never asked me to be his, and I never asked him to save me. We simply walked forward together, two people who knew what it meant to rise from ruin. Elise served her 14-month sentence. Upon release, she sought me out, thinner, quieter, stripped of the illusions that once bound her. "I want to do something real," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been volunteering with a prison reform group. They want me full-time." "Good," I said softly. "Use what you know to change what you can." We exchanged cautious emails for months. Not sisters, not yet. But women bound by blood and scars, learning a new way to exist without drowning in our past. My mother wrote to me once from prison. A short letter, careful script. "Emma, I don't expect forgiveness. I see now that the name I fought to protect was nothing but rot wrapped in gold. You were right to end it. I hope someday you can be proud of yourself. I am, even if I can never tell you in person." I cried when I read it. Silent tears. No anger, left only grief for the girl I'd been desperate for her mother's approval. 1 year later, I stood in my London studio. Marion, my mentor, watched as I adjusted the final look on a model before our new collection debut. Clean lines, ethical fabrics, every stitch deliberate, every fold a reclamation of my craft. "You've changed," Marion said. "I had to," I replied, smoothing a sleeve over the model's arm. "The world tried to break me into someone quiet. I chose to become someone true." That night, I returned to my flat overlooking the Thames. The city pulsed below in veins of orange and gold. I stood on the balcony, breathing in the sharp winter air. My phone buzzed with messages from Dylan, Margaret, Elise, my team. Behind every screen glowed a life rebuilt from ash. I closed my eyes and thought of my grandfather, of his letter hidden in my high school yearbook, "Trust your instincts." The Walker determination runs strong in you. It can be both a blessing and a curse. He was right, but today it was neither. It was simply mine. In the end, I didn't save the family name. I buried it. And in that burial, I planted something new, something unbreakable. A kingdom built not on blood, but on truth, integrity, and my own two hands. 1 year later, the London sky was on fire, with sunset streaks of crimson gold and violet bleeding into each other above the city's jagged silhouette. I stood on the balcony of my studio apartment, warm tea cupped between my hands, the steam curling into the early autumn chill. Behind me, sketches pinned to corkboards fluttered softly in the breeze from the open window. Designs for my upcoming sustainable collection. Simple, deliberate pieces. Nothing gilded for show. Everything honest. My phone buzzed with an email notification. Margaret had sent photos of the community garden project we funded on an abandoned Walker Developments property. Raised beds of vegetables, rows of sunflowers swaying under the Connecticut sky. In the pictures, children laughed as they picked ripe tomatoes. Elderly volunteers smiled as they planted kale seedlings. Life rooted in truth finally growing from the ruin. I closed my eyes, feeling tears prick hot behind my lids. That night, I pulled out my grandfather's old letter, the one written in looping blue ink edges yellowed with time. I sat by my window reading it again under the city's flickering lights. "My dear Emma, trust your instincts. The Walker determination runs strong in you. It can be both a blessing and a curse. Love always, Grandpa." My voice cracked as I whispered into the darkened room, "Grandpa, you were right. They thought your legacy was money, a trust fund, an $8.2 million solution to problems of their own making. But that was never what you left me. What you truly gave me was freedom, the chance to walk away from the rot they called empire, The chance to use your gift for something real, to build, not to buy, to heal, not to hide, to stand on my own name, not theirs. Your inheritance was never about wealth. It was about choice. And today I choose to live without fear of who I am. I choose truth over family illusions. I choose myself. Outside London pulsed with life. Taxis crawled through narrow streets. Neon signs flickered pink and blue over wet pavement. Somewhere below, music thrummed from a bar muffled by distance and glass. I set down my tea, pressing my palm to the window. They had taken my past, twisted it to fuel their greed, but they could never steal this, my future, carved by my own hands. If the people who should love you most turn you into a tool to save themselves from their own sins, would you forgive them, or would you fight to protect the truth? Thank you for staying with me until the very end of Emma's story. Every like, comment, and share from you is not just a number. It's a quiet nod that tells me these stories are reaching someone's heart out there. I hope her journey reminded you that truth is always worth fighting for, no matter how heavy the cost. If this story resonated with you, if it stirred something deep within you, thank you for letting me walk alongside your emotions, even just for a moment. I promise there are many more stories waiting to be told, dark, raw, beautiful, and real. Stay with me, because our stories aren't over yet.